Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the politics and trauma of victimhood. Your readings this week have focused on sexual violence, and today we're going to be talking about the political implications of sexual violence and victimhood and how we construct these concepts. So far in the class we've talked a lot about social construction and the social construction of gender, as well as some concepts such as symbolic violence that help us think through different theoretical frameworks for understanding sexual violence and gender-based violence and the intersections of gender and violence more broadly. So right here at the start, I've got three different images. The first is of a woman who's been raped in the Congo. That's something that we think of traditionally when we talk about gender-based violence, especially Western researchers. We think of rape in the context of war happening in places other than the U.S., other than our nice quote, peaceful society. But then we have down here two different images that I've pulled from sexual violence cases in the U.S. The first is of JonBenét Ramsey. I'm sure many of you are going to recognize this little girl's image because her rape and sexual assault and subsequent murder really fit the construct of what we talk about when we talk about rape. We think of the perfect, blonde, beautiful, young girl or woman, and that's really what gets media play when we're thinking about sexual violence in the U.S. It's either this foreign, exoticized image of rape and victimhood, or this very quaint, chaste, perfect girl next door who happens to be, of course, young, beautiful, white, and probably well-to-do. Then in the corner here, I've got a newspaper article clipped. Says, white girl admits lying, frees Negro of rape. This is an older article, but it also plays at this idea of who can be a victim and who can be prosecuted and seen as a threat for sexual violence. And we're going to talk a little bit about how all these different concepts of race, gender, the politics of being in the U.S. versus doing work abroad, all of these different constructs and how they intersect with sexual violence. So to give you an overview of the course, we're going to be talking first about sexual violence and power. We're then going to talk about these constructions of sexual violence and victimhood, especially how they intersect with race, gender, and class. Some of the theories that we talked about last week, we'll talk a little bit how they inform our understanding of sexual violence. And then we're going to talk about the aftermath of sexual violence, especially about Susan Bryson's book, The Aftermath, Remaking of the Self. So to first start off talking about sexual violence and power, sexual violence, I'm sure many of you are familiar with concepts that talk about rape as a form of power rather than an actual crime that has anything to do with sex. So when we think about sex and sexual violence, the two of those concepts conflated actually are really misleading because that leads us to believe that sexual violence is actually have anything to do with the kind of sex that hopefully some of us enjoy in the concept and in the confines of our relationships. Sex has to do with love, with intimacy, all of those different things run counter to violence. The violence that we talk about when we're talking about sexual violence is really a crime of power. It's about reinforcing the power of the person who is performing the assault or the group that's performing the assault, and then the person being assaulted. So we're going to talk a little bit first about, in both armed conflict and peacetime societies, how sexual violence exploits cultural norms of gender and reinforces the marginalization of victims. So to talk a little bit more about that in detail, the reason sexual violence is effective is because it plays on these ideas of who's subjugated and who has power. Who has power in society? When we think about patriarchal societies or societies that have historically privileged men and historically marginalized women, sexual violence plays off those narratives and reinforces the power of the person committing the assault and marginalizes the person being assaulted. And those things play into larger concepts of group power. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail when we talk about risk reduction later in this lecture. So to get back to sexual violence and the reinforcement of power, the way that works is by playing off cultural norms that reify the construct of women being marginalized and men having power. And you're going to probably ask, how does this play out in LGBTQ relationships. Those intersections are really, once again, about reinforcing who has power in a relationship and who doesn't, and marginalizing those who are being victimized. So those also, of course, in LGBTQ communities intersect with different aspects of who has power in the relationship. And those couples, honestly, are marginalized within the context of our whole society. And when we see claims for justice around issues of rape and domestic violence in the context of an LGBTQ relationship, oftentimes you'll see that those claims fall along the same lines of victimhood and power that you see in heterosexual relationships, where one party is doing it to perform dominance on the other party. So it's really about maintaining and reinforcing power and much less about sex. And the reason it's so effective, it's a practical means of communicating dominance. It's not just about playing off these narratives. It's about using sexual dominance and sexual physical, aggression to marginalize the other person. So it's a way of communicating that one person has power over another, and then also practically reinforcing that by maintaining that power in a very physical way. So we're going to move now into talking a little bit about the construction of sexual violence and victimhood. I'm sure that many of you remember our good friend Todd Akin, who had the poor luck of talking on camera and saying something about legitimate rape. And this really launched a media campaign or media backlash and grassroots backlash against him, saying, isn't sexual violence always sexual violence? But what Todd was really trying to get at, and what Whoopi Goldberg later talked about in her show The View, was what Whoopi Goldberg called rape. What's real rape? Isn't it what we think about when we're talking about, a young, beautiful white girl like JonBenét being raped and assaulted by a stranger? That's actually not the case. It's generally what we know from the research. Rape and sexual violence happen between intimate parties or parties that know each other, not between parties that are strangers. That's the general trend. But what Whoopi Goldberg and Todd Akin were getting at with legitimate rape and rape are these cultural concepts that have constructed rape as something that happens between two strangers, and often that intersect with concepts of race, gender, and class, so that one party is marginalized by their actions and the other party is marginalized by their race. So let's just take a quick look at this video that plays on this idea, and it really tells us more about power in the context of sexual violence. So here we go with Todd Akin.
Are you a woman who sometimes finds it difficult to afford expensive birth control? If so, you're probably suffering from sexually liberated uterine tendencies, a serious medical condition. Fortunately, now there's a treatment that can help. It's called legitimate rape. Legitimate rape activates the body's natural method for preventing pregnancy.
This rape is completely legitimate.
Let's shut this whole thing down.
It was always so hard to remember to take a pill at the same time every day. But with legitimate rape, I prefer not to think about it at all. In clinical studies, legitimate rape did not prevent transmission of HIV or other STDs. Side effects of legitimate rape may include depression, nausea, insomnia, bruising, and accusations that you're just being hysterical. Legitimate rape isn't for everyone. To find out if it's right for you, ask your doctor. Ask your congressman. Under the legal definition of rape that Congressman Todd Akin, Paul Ryan, and 171 other Republicans co-sponsored last January, legitimate rape must be forcibly applied. In layman's terms, that means if you're just a 13-year-old who gets molested by your gym teacher, or a college girl who just gets drugged and wakes up naked in an unfamiliar room, under the Akin-Ryan rape guidelines, your rape is not legitimate, and that means you could still get pregnant. Legitimate rape. It's like regular birth control, except as imagined by crazy people.
So obviously that's a tongue-in-cheek take on a very serious crime. But what they're talking about, and what she played out when saying, that you'll be just accused of being hysterical, really ties into these ideas of who has power and who doesn't, who can claim victimhood and who can't. What Todd Akin was playing out was this idea of real rape is something that happens when it's only physically aggressive. It can't have anything to do with the power structures that can sometimes make it much more of a gray area when we're talking about people being drugged, people being forced to engage in sex acts. with families, things like incest, things like statutory rape, all of those different ideas that we actually don't see of the same caliber of rape, quote unquote, as forcible rape happening between strangers. And that's because it plays off of these cultural constructs of who is a rapist, who is a rape victim. And all of those are informed by our ideas of race, class, and gender. You know, when we're talking about who is a victim and who is not, we have all sorts of media coverage around cases like JonBenet Ramsey or the disappearance of Natalie Holloway, these beautiful, blonde, young, white, affluent young women, as opposed to the millions of women who are victimized by sexual violence and men in context of armed violence like we see in South Sudan and in the Congo, or just here in the U.S. when we talk about rape, we're often excluding the young women and the older women and the LGBTQ populations who have been victims of sexual violence as a means of marginalizing them. If they don't fall into that construct of young, white, upper middle class, beautiful, we're often not hearing about those crimes. And that's because, again, it's intersecting with these ideas of race, gender, class, and legitimacy. And so when we're talking about who has access to justice from these crimes, we're often seeing, you saw in the Donovan article, To Blame or Not to Blame in your reading this week, that often claims to justice are really affected by juries' concepts of sexual violence. So who is a real victim, who is not, and then was that victimhood informed by someone, was the victim assaulted by someone who looks like her, that she knows, or that he knows, or was that happening in this construct of stranger rape that obviously we know is a lot less common, but a lot more highly publicized. So I wanted to move now a little bit and draw from your reading from last week. I want to think back to our discussion from Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence and talk a little bit about risk reduction, quote unquote. Risk reduction is the public policy measures and just measures such as the ones on George Mason campus where we talk about public safety and we ask women to do things like carry their keys in their hands so that they could, ward off an attacker by stabbing them with their keys, or tell us to always make sure that we go to a bathroom with a buddy, or never ever pick up a drink after we've set it down at a party. And when we buy into these ideas and these risk reduction measures, we're buying into this idea that the responsibility for not being victimized is really on the person that might be a victim, as opposed to the person that might be doing the assaulting. And the reason that there's constructed this way, in what I call victim-centric constructions of risk reduction, is because, again, it plays off the power concept. So let's think a little bit about what it would be like to talk about an aggressor-centric construction of sexual violence. So right now we have never walk to your car by yourself after dark. If we were to think about that and invert the power structures there, we'd say never sexually engage with a person without consent. And it's best not to proposition someone by holding a knife to their throat in a dark parking lot. Not a great dating tip. When we're talking about sexual assault prevention, we're always hearing this idea: don't walk to the car by yourself, rather than placing the blame on the potential aggressor and saying, hey, don't assault someone in a dark parking lot. If we flip the construction here and talk about it as aggressor-centric, it calls out the power dynamic. It points out the fact that the people who actually have power in our society are the ones that might become assaulters, not the ones that might become victims. So again, we're going to talk a little bit here, victim-centric. The one you always hear is never put down your drink at a party and then drink from it again. If we were to flip that and think about it from the concept of preventing the rapist from becoming a rapist, we would say never drug a person for the purpose of having non-consensual sex. So again, I only bring these things out to talk about them, to flip the power construct, and to say if we were to invert the way that we think about risk reduction, it would really call into question the ways in which we think about power in society. So we're going to move on just a little bit now and talk about the aftermath of sexual assault. This week you read Susan Bryson's Aftermath, which is one of my favorite books, hands down, about sexual violence, and I hope that you all really enjoyed it. It's definitely a harrowing book to get through, but I think one of the biggest contributions she makes to our concept of sexual violence is to talk about the outliving of oneself. In Bryson's book, she talks about how one outlives oneself when they are sexually assaulted, and that sexual assault undoes one's concept of their own personhood. And from my reading of Brayson's book, it's really because sexual assault interrupts our idea of who we are. Up to the point of the time of an assault, we've always conceptualized ourselves as someone that had autonomy. At the end of the day, what we did with our body was up to our decisions. And what sexual violence does is undermines that concept and says that what you choose to do with yourself on the most intimate level is actually out of your control, and it's in the hands of someone else. And that autonomy is taken away from you, and in that moment, the idea of who you are, your construction of self, is interrupted, and that idea that you have autonomy is completely shattered. And so Brayson talks about how one has to remake oneself, and that is only possible by talking with other people and having the new self reaffirmed. The problem with that, of course, if we think back to our discussions here of power and sexual violence, is that in our society and in many societies, victims are actually silenced. We don't reinforce the idea of sexual violence being something that should be talked about publicly. It's something that's shameful, and it's something that when, the Funny or Die commercial that we just watched, she talked about, you may be accused of being hysterical. That's another way of reinforcing this idea that sexual violence is the fault of the victim rather the fault of the perpetrator. And this silencing not only is harmful because it limits who has access to justice, it's very harmful because it limits the potential of victims to remake oneself, to reconstruct their understanding of who they are, because they're not able to talk about this thing that's been so central to the interruption of who they are and the reconstructing of who they will become. So I like to call this the just get over it complex, this reinforcement of shame that society imposes on victims, this idea that you just need to get over what has happened to you, when really it can be, it probably is the most harrowing thing that someone will go through. And to have society model back to them that that's something that they need to just move past, rather than have affirmed and saying, this is something horrible that happened, and we need to find a way to come together as a community or as a society, or just two people talking discursively about what has happened. That silencing really impacts a victim's ability to move past. So the reason we talk about all of these different things in the context of the individual at this level is to make it possible to understand how this is happening on the individual level, and then connecting it back to that macro understanding. Again, talking about Bourdieu with the symbolic violence, we're thinking about how this individual kind of victimization plays into larger constructs of power, things like symbolic violence, where women collectively buy into the idea of risk reduction, that they have to take matters into their own hands, that the onus is not on the person that might become an assaulter, but rather the person that might be assaulted. We see how the individual level intersects with these larger constructs of power in the context of sexual violence. So thanks all for joining us for this little mini lecture. I hope that you're enjoying this week's readings, and I look forward to seeing all of your discussion posts as we move forward on this week's discussions. Thanks so much.